1928, Middle America. On a train from New York to Los Angeles, disturbed after a business deal gone wrong, an animator pulls out a piece of paper and begins to draw. It's what he's done since the age of 4, so at 27, the stroke of a pencil became more of a meditative practice, a way to ease his mind and circle back to the familiar. But unlike most times, this drawing felt different. It was a mouse, crudely drawn, light on detail, but as he finished, a calm flowed through his mind. Not because of the quality of the drawing, but because, in a sense, he had found himself again. But he needed something catchy, something that would echo through time, or at the very least, make him consider further sketches. He named the mouse Mortimer and placed the drawing back into his pocket and contemplated his next move. Upon arrival in Los Angeles, he showed the drawing of Mortimer to his wife, who laughed and found it cute, if not endearing. The only thing she asked was that he change the name. Mortimer seemed too serious, almost devious. She suggested he name the mouse Mickey. The artist agreed and set the drawing to the side, thinking that he just may have something. 9 years later, at the premiere of his company's first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney instantly became a legend, and his company would transition from bankruptcy to a worldwide conglomerate, worth an estimated $166 billion at the time of this recording. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 12. Thank you for joining me for the 12th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Today we will discuss the life of Walt Disney, a somewhat controversial figure, a visionary, and in some circles a cryogenically frozen megalomaniac overtaken by conservative propaganda. To begin, Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5th, 1901, to a hard-working Irish father and a German mother. The youngest of 4, Walt grew up obsessed with the cinema, and Charlie Chaplin in particular. He was particularly fond of his mother, and as he aged, there grew within him a contempt for his father, not only due to his hard-scrabbled nature, but due to his abusive and controlling behavior, which at the time victimized every member of the Disney family. Walt grew up poor, like most children of that time, but within him he always felt that there was something special about him. The way he saw life, the way he held a unique optimism about the world, no matter what circumstance he found himself in. By the age of 7, the family relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, where Walt spent his days wandering in the wilderness, observing the animals and soaking in the sounds of nature. It was there that his imagination began to flourish, and with his inclination towards art, Walt began to draw whatever he saw. At the age of 7 or 8, Walt came across a baby owl, which he believed to be injured. Like any child, he believed he could assist the animal, so he took it home to nurse his newfound feathered friend back to health. Surprisingly, by the time Walt had smuggled the owl to his room, the owl awakened and attacked Walt, clawing and cawing at the young boy until, out of pure fright, Walt swatted and beat the owl to death. This was a decidedly traumatic experience for the young Walt, and throughout his life he carried an affinity for wildlife which he never let leave. By the age of 16, tired of life in Missouri and the heavy hand of his father, Walt forged a few documents and attempted to enlist in the Army in an effort to escape the drudgery of his life. Rejected due to his height, Walt did find placement as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross, transferring the injured from the battlefield to the hospital. In his free time, Walt collected helmets and drew camouflage and decorations, and as a side hustle, he began to sell the helmets to tourists. This gave him a confidence about his ability to make money from his art, and by the age of 19, when he returned to Kansas City, he found work as an art director at a small firm before he and a friend gained employment at Laugh-O-Gram, a fledgling company on the cutting edge of a new form of art which made short animated films for sale to theaters, which were viewed before the featured presentations. A few years later, the company went bankrupt after a deal with an animation distributor for the amount of $11,000 for a series of short animations fell through. To be clear, fell through is putting it kindly. In reality, after the contract was fulfilled and the shorts were delivered, the distributor simply didn't pay. In 1924, Walt moved to California, finding work under contract, producing live-action films with animation. Success came with a series of shorts entitled The Alice Comedies, based on Alice in Wonderland. Eventually, a prominent distributor by the name of Margaret Winkler hired the animator and his partner, Ube Iwerks, to produce several films at a back-breaking pace. But due to his love for the art and his naivete, the company began to grow. Walt hired several female colorists, paying them the lowest wage possible for the arduous task of inking and coloring. At the time, women made less than their male counterparts, and they were relegated to only coloring, Walt believing that women didn't possess the ability to draw at the level of any man. It was at this time that he married Lillian, his secretary, and began a new character named Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit. It was a success. Believing that he could venture out on his own, Walter approached Margaret to negotiate himself out of the contract and keep his drawings and intellectual property for himself. The year was 1928. What Walt didn't know, and what Margaret certainly understood, was the art of fine print. On the contract he signed, Walt gave the rights to all of his work under contract to Margaret and her company, and if he did decide to leave, he would leave with nothing. It was on that fateful day, dejected on a train, where Walt first drew Mortimer Mouse. Later, he formed a new company, Walt Disney Cartoons, a small company consisting of Walt, his brother Roy, his partner Ube, and their wives. The first cartoons didn't sell, but when Steamboat Willie premiered, a short animation starring Mickey, they were off to the races. By 1933, Walt wanted to expand, so he began to adapt Snow White, a short story well known and written by the Brothers Grimm. 3 years later, the film received several Oscars, and to this day, adjusted for inflation, Snow White is one of the highest grossing films in history. Other films came: Pinocchio, Fantasia, which is considered a masterpiece, although it was a failure at the time. Then came Dumbo, a highly profitable film which allowed Walt to expand even more. The now Walt Disney Studios employed up to 1,000 employees and built a large campus in Burbank, California, equipped with a restaurant, gym, gas station, and a dormitory for those days when an employee wanted to burn the midnight oil. At first, Walt wanted to foster a kinship with his employees. All of them were forbidden to call him by any name other than Walt, and he made sure to be a source of encouragement and a confidant for his employees if needed. But there were inklings of a dictatorship brewing. On the day of his 35th birthday, two animators decided to have a little fun and quickly crafted a short animation of Mickey and Minnie Mouse making out as a light joke. Walt thought it was hilarious, so much so that he immediately asked who made the short. The two animators sheepishly introduced themselves. Walt laughed, shook their hands, and fired them immediately. This was just a sign of things to come. Walt's temper and taste became the thing of legend. Yellings and firings were rampant, and by 1941, the employees formed a union and struck against the company due to low wages, about $12 a week, when the national average was $15. Walt went on a public tirade, accusing them of communism and churning an ever-increasing amount of paranoia which followed him until his death. Walt testified in hearings against his animators, eventually creating a relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. Walter submitted scripts for approval and handed down information on potential communists in order to curry favor. It was around this time that rumors of anti-Semitism began to haunt Walt, but those that knew him dismissed this as slander, and it was never proven, although Walt did give a tour of the studio to a German director, Leni Riefenstahl, a well-known creator of Nazi propaganda, though at the time this was believed to be his way of warming Germany and Hitler into allowing his films to be exhibited in the country. In the years to come, the company began to grow exponentially. Peter Pan, The Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians. The company was flush with cash, and with that cash, Walt built Disneyland, an innovative theme park built in Anaheim, California in 1955. By the 1960s, Disney had visions of creating a bigger and better destination, this time on the East Coast, and he would call it the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, or EPCOT, as it's commonly known. EPCOT would be a city populated by well-to-do people, starting with a small population of 65,000. It would be a shining example of prosperity and a crime-free beacon that would slowly replicate itself into every American city. But Walt would never see this vision come to pass. By the time of his death in 1966, Walt succumbed to lung cancer due to a mind-boggling habit of smoking 3 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day. Disney World was erected in his wake as a twin example to its sister park in California. After his death, despite rumors of being cryogenically frozen, Walt was cremated and interned in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. His was a legacy of mixed feelings and rumor. Some say he was a brilliant visionary, able to see past the boundaries of societal expectations. To others, he was likely a racist, sexist control freak. There's no concrete way to prove the latter, but what we do know is that Walt Disney had core tenets which he lived his life by. Those tenets were curiosity, confidence, courage, and constancy, confidence being the most important. With that confidence, he was able to bypass the life set before him and create a life filled with wealth, fame, and success. Also, a little space in the corner for the imagination. We'll be right back. Thank you for returning. For the second half of the episode, as always, we are going to delve into a short story which hopefully has some connection to the overall theme, and that theme today being confidence. I would like to say that Walt Disney, although he did have somewhat of a checkered past, he was a great example of confidence and what that could actually do for you. And for this short story, we're going to delve into the idea of what the lack of confidence can do to you with a short story called Skinfolk. We begin. As Melinda stepped onto the final vessel, ready for departure, she couldn't help but chuckle at the date. July 3rd. It made sense. Over the course of 5 years, the sound of ships arriving and departing became normal, and if there were any time that the nation and the world would choose to celebrate, July 4th would be the day. 5 years ago, the sky darkened, and the pulsing whirl and rumble of innumerable spacecraft became omnipresent. At first, the entire world assumed that this was their deserved fate. Throughout time immemorial, humanity had squandered its existence in the pursuit of power, status, and money, so much so that the idea of a threat that had no desire for any of it became inconceivable. There had been warnings for over a millennia, a sighting here and there, an abduction in diverse places, even a child's drawing. But now the culmination of all of those events had come to pass, and as each of the ships lowered into the atmosphere in a metallic fog, 8 billion people became instantaneously aware of their collective lapse in judgment. In typical American fashion, the citizens assumed that the invasion was contained within their borders. But as footage from around the planet started to interrupt every transmission worldwide, it had become clear that each of the 193 countries had now become overtaken by clusters of silver-alloyed ships humming and shimmering in the sky. Each ship was massive. The smallest among them was easily the size of 2 football stadiums. The largest ship, roughly the size of 10, hovered above the center of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by 100 or so smaller vessels. For days, the vessels idled mid-air without a sound. News reports of multiple military aircraft crashing into invisible barriers upon approach started to grow as the world prepared to defend itself. But suddenly, on the 4th day, an unrecognizable voice, translated into every language known to man, was heard from sea to shining sea. The voice introduced itself as Doto, leader of Prometheus 4, a large planet more than 4.2 light years away. Doto went on to explain that they meant no harm to the human race, and that a meeting with each ruler of each nation was humbly requested, and if that request was denied, they would make it so, regardless of one's resistance. Doto explained that although this was not a threat, any further show of force by humans would result in immediate defensive measures. Also, they would begin teleportation of each leader individually, starting with the smallest nation first. With that, Pope Pius VIII was immediately transferred from Vatican City into a smaller vessel and abruptly shuttled to Doto's ship. 2 days later, at a press conference, Pope Pius assured the world that the visitors were kind and hospitable and that they held nothing but the highest respect for humanity. He went on to encourage each of the nation's rulers to meet with Doto and set aside any prejudice they may have held in their hearts and minds. When asked by a reporter to describe the intention of the visit and the appearance of Doto, Pius refused, saying he promised Doto that his appearance and the appearance of all of the Prometheans would be revealed at a time of their choosing, and their intentions were good. 90 days later, after the President of the United States had met with Doto and returned to the White House, a presidential address to the nation was announced, along with a simulcast to be transmitted throughout the globe. The next day, Melinda and every other being on Earth collected themselves in front of every television, computer, phone, and device available in order to hear exactly what had transpired over the last 90 days. There had been rumors floating about. They want to rule over us, extract our resources, and intermingle among us. In prior weeks, several pockets of the Earth started to experience mass suicides and murders. But at 7 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, the President of the United States stood with a nervous grin before his podium, seal emblazoned, and announced that effective immediately, all beings of African descent had been traded to the Prometheans in exchange for what amounted to $500 trillion in diamonds. These diamonds were harvested from an asteroid intercepted within the Promethean solar system many Earth years ago. The president continued, saying that this exchange was non-negotiable and that all DNA and ancestral information had been reviewed, accepted, and dispersed between nations and the Prometheans, and extraction would begin immediately, ending in approximately 5 years. He did manage to feign remorse, but assured all of the new appointees that he was shown evidence that life would be good on Prometheus 4, and that he would not have accepted the exchange if it were not beneficial for mankind. He then took several questions from reporters, but each inquiry was met with the timid response of, "I am not at liberty to comment on that at the moment." Finally, the president ended his address with a mishmash of platitudes, followed by a warning that this was indeed non-negotiable, and any appointee caught trying to halt or sabotage the agreement would be arrested and handed over to the Prometheans immediately. From that moment forward, life became a surreal mix of fear and acceptance. A daily onslaught of boycotts and protests filled the streets. Athletes and entertainers of all races banded together, creating ad campaigns pleading for an immediate termination of the extraction, along with a formal apology to those affected. These pleas were ignored, and over the next months and years, the population of those of African descent began to slowly decrease from a robust 2 billion to a few 100,000. Even the protests had shrunk from a public outcry to a private rumor attended by no one of note. Among the remaining few, Melinda accepted the futility of it all. Her life on Earth wasn't remarkable, even before the so-called invaders, and although her future was certainly a mystery, she couldn't imagine it being any less bearable than her current state. Melinda hated the color of her skin. This was a private thought, but a constant one. To her, her dark skin impeded her happiness, rendering her hopeless and melancholic. She was never one of the chosen. Her dating life was non-existent, and to Melinda, it was solely the fault of her pigment. As a child, she endured an unhealthy amount of teasing and ridicule due to her skin tone, not to mention the suspicion of every store clerk, cop, and vendor she'd ever encountered. But things were oddly better on Earth during the last 5 years. After the diamonds arrived, any appointee was given all goods and services free of charge. This included healthcare and housing. She no longer needed to work, and most of her days were spent reading and watching updates on television showing the decreased world population and how the money generated from the diamonds had aided in several infrastructure projects on every continent, along with medical breakthroughs and cures discovered due to the generous help of the Prometheans. On the morning of July 3rd, Melinda received a phone call from a woman with a pleasant-sounding voice, thanking her for her service as an appointee, and also instructing her to report to the Santa Monica Pier by 6 a.m. for transmittal. Within herself, Melinda accepted her fate, whatever that might be. Her condominium had already been shown and purchased by a nice family of Nebraskans who wanted to start life anew. All members of her family had either been long buried or scuttled off onto some spacecraft, and realistically, the option of choice was a fantasy she couldn't afford to indulge in. With that in mind, Melinda ate a light breakfast of eggs and toast, enjoyed an expensive cup of coffee, and stepped into a waiting SUV parked outside her building. Along the silent drive to the pier, Melinda took time to soak up her surroundings. The metropolitan majesty of California, the mountains and valleys, the newly crisp air due to the decrease in population. As a faint sadness began to fill her heart, the driver felt it necessary to interrupt the moment by telling her that he thought that this was a tragedy, and that if there was something he could do, he certainly would have. Melinda thanked him for his candor, but reminded him that a simple no would have prevented all of this from happening. The truth of her words silenced the driver, and in that silence they arrived at the pier, where thousands of people who looked just like her waited in line as a large ship sipped them into its hull, one by one, almost instantaneously. As she waited in line, conversations among the appointees began to bubble. They varied from conspiracy-laden nonsense to palpable anger. Some of them were elated, and others cried uncontrollably. A few held pictures of their so-called friends and co-workers that they would never see again, but Melinda said nothing. She only watched in disbelief as the world she had inherited rejected her with ease and a compliance that baffled her. What would this world be without them? What artful masterpieces would now be scattered into oblivion? What genius and ingenuity would now go untouched? These thoughts and more ping-ponged in her mind until before she knew it, she stood at the edge of the pier, eyes agape, as a silver monstrosity beamed a vibrating cerulean light onto her flesh from above and jolted her into the unknown. When the light receded, Melinda stood before a slender figure, roughly 7 feet tall, mouthless, with a complexion that could only be described as Vanta black. Its skin absorbed all light, making it appear more shadow-like. The whites of its eyes were striking, causing her to squint, while its pupils were an amalgamation of color that shifted slowly from the more familiar brown, blue, and green to a mixture of colors Melinda nor any other human had ever seen in their life. Melinda's first impulse was to shriek or possibly give way to the multitude of emotions that rushed through her and faint. But before her fear could get the best of her, the creature waved his thin hand over her forehead, causing a serene calm to wash over her. Within seconds, a smile formed on her face, and as she looked in every direction, she saw that her fellow appointees, numbering in the thousands, stood patiently in multiple lines in complete euphoria. Their former stressors, concerns, and trauma slipped from their minds like wind through a colander. All that remained was the wispy voice of the creature telepathically introducing himself as Xanxus, their guide and counsel for the journey to come. Moments later, a holographic vision engulfed them, replaying their evolutionary path, Homo habilis to Homo sapien, wars with Neanderthal kings, the perils of famine and migration, leaders assassinated, cowardly betrayals, and slavery. The full panoply of African history flashed before their eyes, now real and perceptible to the senses. Several of the appointees began to weep, but the voice of Xanxus entered their minds, calming them and assuring them that their plight had not gone unnoticed, and that what they thought was an extraction into servitude was a redemptive intervention. Xanxus went on to explain that the journey would be long. What would take over 6,000 Earth years would take 5 due to their technology, and upon entering into the inner sanctum of the vessel, they were free to live their lives awake amongst each other or incubate until they arrived at Prometheus 4. On Earth, as the final ship ascended and departed into space, a hollow emptiness settled upon the globe. A blandness seeped into the air as if salt had been siphoned from preserved meat. Many mourned, others celebrated, while most began to orchestrate ways to stake their claim within this new Earth. The next day, July 4th, an announcement was made, stating that the new rulers had been prepared to take leadership over the masses, and although they would miss their former ilk, poverty and disease had been eradicated, and humanity was now destined for a new chapter of prosperity and technical advancements never seen before. In America, a National Day of Remembrance was instituted to occur on March 5th of each year, in honor of the departed, and Crispus Attucks, a black soldier and the first to die during the American Revolution against the British. Participation was, of course, seldom and voluntary. In the inner sanctum of the ship, Melinda and her fellow appointees were greeted by a large group of Promethean caretakers, eager to assist them with every want and need they could imagine. Due to the size of the ship, several sectors had been designated for physical activity and the pursuit of hobbies and education. This included Promethean history and law, customs and modes of travel. The ship was equipped with several large units for housing, and a massive nursery was erected for those expecting children. The caretakers prepared exquisite and newfound meals with nutrient-rich ingredients and upkeep of the ship. Even a sun-like light rose and set daily over the inner sanctum in order to preserve their circadian rhythm. Over the weeks and months that followed, Melinda couldn't help but wonder about the goings-on of Earth. She wasn't alone. Most of the appointees, although grateful, still held a deep connection to their former planet, and a sense of loss began to grow among them. Knowing their collective thoughts, Xanxus and the caretakers revealed that their rescue was not completely altruistic. Astronomers on Earth had discovered a large asteroid named Apophis that was set to collide with the planet within a year, but they had possessed the ability to shift it out of orbit before impact. What they didn't know was that Chem, an asteroid 30 times the size of Apophis, was on a course to hit the planet no less than 30 years later, and due to its size and speed, there would be no way to avoid impact, and the Earth, as they knew it, would cease to exist. Xanxus explained that Dodo revealed this information to the rulers of the Earth, offering the technology to destroy the asteroid or the trove of diamonds in exchange for the appointees. But each ruler chose the diamonds, believing that somehow they would find a way to rid themselves of the asteroid and the melanated people at the same time. As foolish as this was, Dodo granted their wish, and now Melinda and her fellow appointees were able to continue their species with the Promebians in relative peace and tranquility. 4 Earth years later, when the ship landed on Prometheus 4, Melinda exited the ship, surrounded by millions of Promebians and those of African descent. The planet was an absolute marvel of technology and beauty. All living things, whether a blade of grass or a drop of water, hummed in unison. And for the first time in her life, Melinda was ever so thankful for the color of her skin. Thank you for joining us, or me, for the 12th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. As I stated before, today's episode is about confidence, or the lack thereof. I hope that you found this episode to be, thought-provoking at the very least. As always, you can reach me via email at swtomail@gmail.com. Again, that is swtomail@gmail.com. Until the next 2 weeks, I want you guys to always be happy, be helpful, and by all means, be mindful of the stories that you tell yourself.